You ever see a man stand still while everyone else loses control? The question cut through the dry afternoon air as boots crunched over loose gravel, and the hum of distant generators filled the silence between breaths. The kind of silence that didn't belong on a U.S. military base where everything moved with purpose. Everything except the old man standing alone near the restricted line, his posture relaxed, hands at his sides, eyes steady like he was watching something no one else could see. While 20 feet away, Lieutenant Ryan Cole adjusted his gloves and stepped forward with the sharp confidence of someone who had never been ignored before. "Sir, you're not authorized to be here." His voice clean, practiced, edged with authority that hadn't been tested, the kind that expected compliance on the first word. But the old man didn't move, didn't even blink, just stood there in a worn jacket that had seen too many seasons and boots that carried dust from places no one here had ever walked. The wind tugging lightly at the faded fabric like it recognized something the rest of the base didn't. Cole took another step, closer now, close enough to smell the leather and time. "I'm talking to you." Louder this time, drawing eyes from nearby personnel, a few turning casually, a few already sensing something off, but still no response. Just that same stillness, not defiance, not fear, something heavier, something settled, like a man who had waded through worse and didn't feel the need to explain himself anymore. Cole exhaled through his nose, irritation building. "All right, that's enough." He signaled to the military police standing nearby. "Detain him." The word landed harder than it should have, sharp against the quiet, and 2 MPs stepped in, hands firm but controlled, taking hold of the old man's arm as gravel shifted under their boots, the movement breaking the stillness for the first time. But even then, the old man didn't resist, didn't argue, didn't even look at them, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the chain-link fence, beyond the hangars, beyond the heat shimmer rising off the asphalt like ghosts in the distance. Cole circled slightly, studying him now, searching for something, anything that explained the calm. "You got a name?" he asked, tone dropping into something colder, but the old man only shifted his eyes slightly, just enough to meet Cole's for a brief second. Pale blue, clear, steady, and for a fraction of a moment, something in Cole's chest tightened without explanation, gone just as quickly as it came, replaced by irritation. "Figures," he muttered, reaching out and grabbing at the old man's jacket, fingers brushing against a small, tarnished piece of metal stitched near the chest, crooked, dull, almost invisible unless you were looking for it. "What is this?" Cole said, pulling it free with a quick motion, holding it up between 2 fingers like it weighed nothing, some kind of souvenir. A few nearby soldiers let out quiet chuckles, the tension thinning just enough to feel like control again. But in the back, Sergeant Lucas Reed had stopped moving entirely, his eyes narrowing, not on the metal, not on Cole, but on the old man's posture, the way he stood even while being held, the way his shoulders didn't collapse under pressure, the way his breathing didn't change. Reed had seen that before, not in training, not in simulations, but in places where stillness meant survival. And suddenly the noise of the base felt wrong, too loud, too careless. He reached slowly for his phone, stepping back into the shade without drawing attention, his thumb hovering for a second before dialing a number he didn't use lightly. While out on the open gravel, Cole flicked the metal once with his finger, a sharp little tap that echoed louder than it should have. "Doesn't mean anything here," he said, and somewhere far off, past the heat and steel and distance, the low rumble of an approaching engine began to rise, unnoticed by most, but not by everyone. The sound grew first, a low vibration under the soles of boots before it ever reached the ears, a distant engine pushing through the heat waves rolling above the asphalt. And Sergeant Lucas Reed felt it before he fully heard it, his eyes lifting toward the far access road where a thin line of dust began to rise against the horizon, his phone still pressed to his ear as he stepped further into the shade, voice low and controlled, giving only what was necessary. While back on the gravel, Lieutenant Ryan Cole remained focused on the old man, still holding that dull piece of metal between his fingers as if it were proof of something insignificant. "You know what your problem is?" Cole said, pacing once in a tight arc, boots grinding small stones into the ground. "You think silence makes you important." A few of the nearby soldiers shifted, some folding their arms, others watching with quiet curiosity. The the kind that builds when something does not feel quite right, but no one can explain why. The military police still held the old man's arms, firm but no longer forceful, as if even they were beginning to sense that pushing further might cross a line they could not see. The old man's breathing remained steady, slow, measured, like a rhythm set long ago and never broken. His eyes drifting past Cole again, not dismissing him, not challenging him, simply looking through him as though the moment had already passed somewhere else. Cole followed that gaze for a second, irritation flickering, then shook it off. "Look at me when I am talking to you," he snapped, but the words did not land the way he expected. They seemed to fall short, absorbed by the quiet weight that surrounded the man, a weight that did not come from rank or uniform, but from something older, something carried, something earned in ways that did not need explanation. The wind picked up slightly, tugging at loose fabric, carrying the faint scent of fuel and sun-baked metal across the open space. And then the sound became undeniable. Engines, multiple, approaching fast, not routine, not scheduled. The kind of arrival that made heads turn without orders. One soldier near the perimeter straightened instinctively. Another lowered his voice mid-sentence. Conversations thinning into silence as attention shifted toward the access road, where the dust plume now grew larger, darker, moving with intent. Cole noticed it too, his posture tightening, eyes narrowing as he turned halfway, still holding the metal piece. "What is that?" someone muttered under their breath, but no one answered. Because no one needed to, the formation of vehicles broke through the heat haze. Black SUVs, polished, official, moving faster than protocol usually allowed on base. Their presence cutting through the routine like a blade through fabric. Reed ended his call without another word, slipping the phone back into his pocket, his jaw set now, the decision made. And for the first time since the confrontation began, he looked directly at the old man, really looked, and there it was again, that stillness. That unmistakable presence that did not belong to someone lost or confused, but to someone who had already seen how this would end. The vehicles closed the distance quickly, tires biting into gravel as they approached, slowing only at the last second. And as the first SUV came to a sharp stop, the engine idling low and controlled, the entire space seemed to hold its breath. Cole lowered his hand slightly without realizing it, the small piece of metal catching the sunlight for just a moment, and the rear door of the lead vehicle opened with deliberate precision, a figure stepping out into the glare, posture straight, movement calm but absolute. And in that instant, before a single word was spoken, the balance in the air shifted, subtle but undeniable, like the moment before a storm breaks. And somewhere deep in his chest, Lieutenant Ryan Cole felt something unfamiliar begin to settle in. Not fear, not yet, but the quiet understanding that whatever was about to happen next was no longer under his control. The door of the SUV closed with a quiet, controlled thud that carried more authority than any shouted command. And Colonel David Mercer stepped forward into the heat, his uniform crisp, his pace unhurried, yet every movement carried weight, the kind that did not need to announce itself. Conversations died instantly, boots shifted, backs straightened without being told, and even the wind seemed to pull back for a second as his eyes scanned the scene, not wide, not searching, but precise, calculating, taking in the details in a single sweep. The MPs holding the old man, Lieutenant Ryan Cole standing just off center, the small piece of metal still caught between his fingers. And then Mercer's gaze settled, locking onto the old man as if the rest of the world had faded out around him. And something in his expression changed, not dramatically, not enough for most to notice, but enough for those who knew what to look for. Sergeant Lucas Reed saw it immediately, a recognition that ran deeper than protocol, deeper than rank. Cole felt it too without understanding it, his posture tightening as he instinctively took a step forward. "Sir," he began, voice sharp again, trying to regain control. This individual was found inside a restricted area and refused to comply. The words sounded correct, structured, exactly what they were supposed to be, but they landed differently now. Thinner, like they were missing something essential. Mercer did not respond right away. He did not even look at Cole. Instead, he took one more step forward, closing the distance, his eyes still fixed on the old man. And for a brief moment, the entire base seemed to exist in that narrow space between them. The MPs shifted slightly, uncertain now, their grip loosening just enough to be felt but not seen. Mercer stopped just a few feet away, close enough to see the lines on the old man's face. The years written there not as weakness, but as record. And when he finally spoke, his voice was low, steady, controlled. Release him. It was not loud. It did not need to be. The command moved through the air with quiet certainty. And the MPs reacted immediately, hands pulling back as if they had been waiting for permission, stepping away without hesitation. Cole blinked, caught off guard. Sir, with respect, we have not confirmed his identity, he said, trying to hold on to the authority he had just minutes ago. But Mercer raised a hand slightly, not even looking at him, and that single gesture ended the sentence before it could continue. The silence that followed was heavier than before, no longer uncertain, but focused. Mercer's attention dropped briefly to Cole's hand, too. The small piece of metal still held there, and then back to the old man. Where did you get that? He asked, not to Cole, but to the man who had never spoken more than a few words since this began. The old man's eyes shifted down for the first time, resting on the metal, and then back up to Mercer, and for the first time, something moved in his expression, not emotion exactly, but acknowledgement, quiet, measured. It was given, he said, his voice rough, steady, carrying something older than the moment itself. Mercer inhaled slowly, the kind of breath taken when a memory surfaces uninvited, and for a second, just a second, the structure of the present seemed to bend around something buried in the past. Cole looked between them, confusion growing, the situation slipping further beyond his understanding. Sir, if there is some kind of mistake, he started again, but this time Mercer turned, finally meeting his eyes, and there was no anger there, no raised voice, just something far more final. Lieutenant, he said evenly, there is no mistake, and the words settled into the ground like weight, unmovable, undeniable, and all at once the balance of power that had defined the last 10 minutes collapsed completely, not with force, but with truth, and no one present could quite explain why the air suddenly felt different, heavier, as if the space itself had just remembered something important. The words settled and did not move, and for a long second no one spoke, not because they were waiting for permission, but because something in the air had shifted into a kind of quiet that demanded stillness. Colonel David Mercer turned back toward the old man, his gaze steady, searching not for confirmation but for recognition already found, and when he spoke again his voice carried less command and more memory. Arthur Hale, he said, not as a question but as something long known, and the name moved through the gathered soldiers like a ripple, unfamiliar to most, but heavy all the same. The old man did not react immediately, his eyes narrowing just slightly as if measuring the distance between past and present. Then he gave the smallest nod, not proud, not defensive, simply acknowledging the truth spoken aloud. Mercer exhaled quietly, the kind of breath a man takes when something long buried rises to the surface. And for a moment his posture softened, almost imperceptibly, before settling back into form. But the change had already been seen by those paying attention. Sergeant Lucas Reed felt it like a confirmation of everything his instincts had been telling him since the beginning. Lieutenant Ryan Cole did not move, his hand still holding the piece of metal, though now it felt different, heavier somehow, like it carried a meaning he had not been prepared to understand. Sir, Cole said again, slower this time, less certain. Who is he? And the question hung there, honest now, stripped of arrogance. Mercer looked at him, really looked this time, not with judgment, but with the calm patience of someone about to explain something that should not have needed explaining. He is the reason some of the men in this base are still here, Mercer said, his tone even, controlled, but each word landed with weight. A few heads turned, others straightened unconsciously. The kind of reaction that comes when a statement carries truth beyond rank. Cole blinked, processing, but not yet understanding. Mercer took one step closer to Arthur Hale, closing the final distance, his eyes dropping briefly to the worn jacket, to the place where the metal had been pulled loose. That piece you are holding, Mercer continued, without raising his voice, does not belong to a uniform. It belongs to a moment. He paused, just enough for the words to settle. A moment where standing still meant everything. The wind moved again, softer now, carrying the faint hum of engines idling behind them, the vehicles waiting, the drivers silent, as if even they understood this was not a moment to interrupt. Arthur's gaze shifted down once more, not to reclaim the metal, but to acknowledge it, and in that brief glance something else moved beneath the surface, not a full memory, but the edge of one, the echo of heat, noise, urgency, something that lived in the body long after the moment passed. Mercer reached out slowly, not with force, but with respect, and took the small piece of metal from Cole's hand, the movement careful, deliberate, as though it required permission even though none was spoken. Cole did not resist, his fingers releasing it without thought, and for the first time since this began, he took a step back, not ordered, not instructed, just instinctively creating space. Mercer turned the metal slightly in the light, studying it for a second that seemed longer than it was. Then he looked back at Arthur, and in that look was something unmistakable, not authority, not command, but respect, earned and absolute, the kind that cannot be given lightly. "You should not have been stopped," Mercer said quietly, and though the sentence was simple, it carried the weight of correction, not just of action, but of understanding, and around them the base remained silent, every eye fixed, every movement paused, because everyone present knew, even if they could not explain it, that whatever had just been revealed was only the beginning of something far deeper than a misunderstanding. The statement lingered in the air, and no one moved to challenge it, because there was nothing in Colonel Mercer's tone that invited debate, only a quiet certainty that settled deeper with each passing second. He turned the small piece of metal in his fingers once more, the sunlight catching along its worn edges, revealing scratches and marks that were not random, but carried the story of something that had endured far more than time alone. And when he spoke again, his voice lowered slightly, not to hide the words, but to give them weight. "This was never meant to be worn," he said, his eyes still on the object. "It was never issued, never recorded, never entered into any system you could search." A few of the soldiers exchanged glances, confusion mixing with curiosity, because everything they knew about recognition came with paperwork, with databases, with official lines that could be verified. But this was something else entirely. Mercer lifted his gaze back to Arthur Hale, and there was a shift there again, subtle but unmistakable, a bridge forming between two men who understood something no one else present fully could. It was given in a place where no records were kept. Mercer continued, and now even the air seemed to lean closer. A place where the only thing that mattered was who stood and who did not. The words did not need to be explained further. They carried their own meaning, heavy and unspoken. Arthur remained still, his expression unchanged, but his eyes had moved slightly, not away, not down, but inward, as if following the echo of something far removed from this quiet base, something that lived beyond memory, in the kind of space that did not fade. Lieutenant Ryan Cole swallowed once, the motion small but visible, his earlier certainty now replaced by something unfamiliar, something closer to realization. "Sir," he said carefully, choosing each word now, "why is he here?" And this time the question carried no edge, no challenge, only the need to understand. Mercer did not answer immediately. Instead, he took a slow step to the side, aligning himself beside Arthur rather than in front of him, a gesture that shifted the entire dynamic without a single command. And when he finally spoke, it was not directed at Cole alone, but at everyone within earshot. "He was asked to come," Mercer said, his tone steady, "by someone who remembers exactly what this piece represents." A ripple moved through the group again, softer this time, more focused. Sergeant Reed's jaw tightened slightly as the pieces began to align in his mind. The call he had made, the urgency in the response, the speed of the arrival, none of it had been routine, none of it had been coincidence. Mercer turned slightly, gesturing toward the vehicles that had brought him here, their engines still idling low, controlled, waiting. "There are people on this base right now who owe their lives to decisions made in moments like the one that created this," he said. And though he did not raise his voice, the impact of the statement landed fully. Some of the younger soldiers straightened without realizing it, their posture shifting as understanding began to take root. Cole looked at the ground briefly, then back up, his grip on authority now fully gone, replaced by something far more grounded, respect that had not been given but uncovered. Mercer extended his hand toward Arthur, not to command, but to return, placing the small piece of metal back into the place it had been taken from, his movements careful, precise, as if restoring something that should never have been disturbed. And for a brief moment, as his fingers adjusted the worn fabric, the world seemed to narrow again, the present pulling tight around a single point. Arthur's hand rose slightly, just enough to steady the fabric, and in that small motion there was acknowledgement, not of Mercer's rank, but of the understanding between them. Mercer stepped back then, giving space, but not distance. And when he looked back toward the others, his expression had settled, fully into command once more. "What you saw here," he said evenly, "was not a mistake." And the words carried across the gravel, firm and final. It was a reminder. No one spoke, no one moved, because in that moment, every person present understood that something had just been revealed that could not be undone, and whatever came next would carry the weight of that truth. The word lingered, reminder, and it did not fade. It settled into the ground beneath their boots, into the steel around them, into the silence that now felt heavier than before. Colonel Mercer did not raise his voice again. He did not need to. The authority had already shifted, fully, completely, and no one present could deny it. He turned slightly, his gaze moving across the gathered soldiers, not inspecting, not judging, but measuring, as if weighing what each of them had understood from the moment that had just unfolded. Some stood straighter, others lowered their eyes briefly, not out of shame, but out of recognition. Sergeant Lucas Reed remained still, his arms relaxed at his sides, but his attention sharp, locked on Arthur Hale, watching the way the old man adjusted his jacket with a slow, practiced motion, fingers brushing over the small piece of metal now returned to its place, not with pride, not with display, but with the quiet care of someone restoring something that belonged exactly where it was. Lieutenant Ryan Cole shifted his weight, the gravel under his boots giving a soft crunch that seemed louder than it should have in the silence. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then stopped, the words no longer coming as easily as they had before, because whatever he had thought this situation was, it was no longer that, and he knew it. Mercer stepped back one pace, not creating distance, but allowing space for the moment to settle. Then he spoke again, not loudly, but clearly enough for every ear present. "There are no records for what he did," he said, his eyes briefly meeting Cole's before moving on. "No citations you can pull up, no reports you can review." He paused, letting that truth stand on its own. "And that is exactly why it matters." A faint breeze moved across the base, carrying with it the distant hum of aircraft somewhere beyond the visible horizon, a reminder that operations continued, that the world outside this moment did not stop. But here, in this space, time felt suspended, held in place by something larger than routine. Arthur Hale finally shifted his stance, just slightly, his weight moving from one foot to the other, not restless, but deliberate, as if preparing to leave a place he had never intended to stay in the first place. His eyes moved once across the group, not searching, not challenging, simply acknowledging their presence. And for a brief second, those who met his gaze felt it, that same quiet weight, that same unspoken understanding that had unsettled them from the beginning. Mercer noticed the movement and gave a small nod, not commanding, not dismissing, but allowing. "You came as requested," he said to Arthur, his tone even. "That is all that was needed." Arthur gave a slight inclination of his head, the gesture minimal, but complete. Then he turned, not sharply, not dramatically, just a simple motion, and began to walk, his boots pressing into the gravel with a steady rhythm, each step measured, unhurried, as if he had nowhere urgent to be, and yet carried the sense that he had already done what was required long before arriving here. The path toward the vehicles remained open, no one stepping in his way, no one speaking, because there was nothing left to say that would not diminish the moment. Cole watched him go, his earlier certainty now fully replaced by something else, something quieter, something that would not leave easily. Reed exhaled slowly, the tension in his chest easing just enough to recognize what had just passed. Mercer remained where he stood for a moment longer, his gaze following Arthur's retreating figure. Then he turned back to the group, his expression once again composed, controlled, but now carrying a layer that had not been there before, something closer to expectation. Remember this, he said. And though the words were simple, they carried further than any command. Not everything important is written down. The statement settled over them, and this time, it did not feel like instruction. It felt like something that would stay long after the dust had settled and the engines had gone quiet, long after the moment itself had passed into memory. The sound of Arthur Hale's boots on gravel faded slowly, not because he hurried, but because no one dared to interrupt the rhythm. Each step measured, steady, carrying the kind of quiet finality that did not ask for acknowledgement, and yet demanded it. The line of black vehicles waited ahead, engines low, doors still open as if time itself had paused to let him pass. And for a moment, no one moved. Not even after he reached the first SUV, not even as a driver stepped forward and opened the rear door without a word. The gesture precise, respectful, practiced. Arthur paused just before entering, not turning fully, but enough for his gaze to sweep once more across the base, across the soldiers, across the moment that had unfolded. And there was no pride in that look, no satisfaction, only a quiet closure, as if something unfinished had finally reached its end. Then he stepped inside, the door closing softly behind him, and the sound, though small, seemed to echo longer than it should have. Colonel Mercer stood still for a second longer, his eyes fixed on the vehicle. Then he exhaled slowly and turned back toward the formation, the authority returning fully to his posture, but now anchored by something deeper than command. "Lieutenant Cole," he said, and the name carried with it no anger, only expectation. Cole straightened immediately, instinct overriding everything else. "Sir," he replied, his voice firm but different now. Stripped of the earlier edge, Mercer stepped closer, not invading space, but closing the distance enough to make the moment personal. "You followed procedure," Mercer said evenly, and for a brief second Cole felt relief begin to surface, but it did not last. "But you did not read the man," Mercer continued, and the words landed heavier than any reprimand. Cole held his posture, but his jaw tightened slightly, absorbing it, understanding it in a way he would not forget. Mercer's gaze shifted past him, addressing the others without raising his voice. "Uniforms, ranks, credentials," he said. "They matter, but they are not everything." The statement moved through the group like a quiet current, some nodding almost imperceptibly, others standing still as if committing every word to memory. Sergeant Lucas Reed lowered his eyes briefly, not in submission, but in agreement, because he had seen it, felt it, before anyone else had spoken it aloud. Mercer turned slightly, gesturing toward the space Arthur had just crossed, now empty, yet somehow still holding his presence. "There are men who carry entire histories without a single line in a file," Mercer said, his tone steady. "And if you cannot recognize that, then you are only seeing half the field." The engines of the SUVs began to rise slightly in pitch, a signal more than a sound, and slowly, deliberately, the vehicles pulled away, gravel shifting beneath the tires as they moved back toward the road, carrying Arthur Hale with them, the dust trailing behind like a fading memory. No sirens, no urgency, just quiet departure. And as the last vehicle disappeared beyond the heat haze, the base seemed to breathe again, the tension releasing in small, almost invisible ways. Cole remained where he stood, his eyes still fixed on the empty space, replaying the moment, not the words, but the silence between them, the weight of something he had not understood until it was already gone. Reed stepped forward slightly, just enough to stand beside him, not speaking, not needing to. The lesson had already been delivered, and it did not require repetition. Mercer gave one final look across the group, then turned and walked back toward the remaining vehicle, his pace steady, controlled, the moment behind him now, but not forgotten. And as the sound of the engines faded into the distance, what remained was not the confrontation, not the correction, but the quiet understanding that some truths did not need to be announced to be known. The dust settled slowly across the asphalt, drifting in thin waves that caught the sunlight before disappearing into the heat. And for a long moment no one spoke, not because they were waiting for orders, but because the space Arthur Hale had just left still felt occupied, as if something invisible remained standing there, steady and unmoved. Lieutenant Ryan Cole finally shifted, the motion small but deliberate, his eyes dropping briefly to the ground where the gravel had been disturbed, tracing the path of those last steps as though they might explain something he had missed. But there was nothing there except the faint imprint of boots and the quiet weight of realization. Sergeant Lucas Reed stood beside him, arms relaxed, gaze forward, but his attention was not on the empty space anymore. It was on the people, watching how they processed what had just happened. Some avoided eye contact, others stood straighter than before, as if correcting something internal, something unspoken. The base had returned to motion, but it was slower now, more deliberate, like a machine recalibrating after a sudden shift. A young private near the perimeter adjusted his stance, glancing once toward Cole before quickly looking away, not out of fear, but out of respect that had not been there earlier. Cole noticed it, and for the first time since stepping into command that day, he did not feel the need to respond. Colonel Mercer's vehicle idled a few yards away, the last remaining presence of the interruption that had changed everything. Mercer stood just outside the open door, speaking quietly with one of his aides, but even from a distance, his posture carried the same steady control, the same quiet certainty. When he finished, he turned back once more, scanning the area, not checking for compliance, but for understanding. And when his eyes briefly met Cole's again, there was no correction this time, no instruction, only acknowledgement, the kind that said the lesson had been delivered, and what came next depended entirely on the one who received it. Cole held that gaze for a second, then gave a slight nod, not out of habit, but out of something deeper, something that had shifted inside him in a way he could not fully explain yet. Mercer stepped into the vehicle then, the door closing with the same controlled precision as before, and moments later, the engine note rose, the SUV pulling away smoothly, following the path of the others until it too disappeared into the distance, leaving the base in its original stillness, but not unchanged. The sound of a distant aircraft passed overhead, low and steady, its shadow gliding briefly across the ground before vanishing beyond the hangars. A reminder that operations continued, that time did not stop for any one moment. But for those who had stood there, time had marked something permanent. Reed exhaled slowly and finally spoke, his voice low, almost reflective. "You felt it too," he said, not a question, but a statement. Cole did not answer right away, his eyes still fixed on the space where everything had shifted. Then he nodded once, slowly. "I did," he replied, his voice quieter than before, not weakened, but grounded. Reed gave a slight nod in return, then stepped away, returning to his duties without another word, because nothing more needed to be said. The lesson was already in place. Cole remained where he was for a few seconds longer, then turned, scanning the base with new eyes, not just looking for compliance, but for something else, something less visible, more human, more real. And as he took his first step forward, the gravel crunching beneath his boots sounded different, not louder, not softer, just clearer, as if the noise itself carried meaning now. And though the moment had passed, its weight did not fade. It stayed, settled into the rhythm of the base, into the posture of the soldiers, into the silence between words, a quiet reminder that not everything that matters wears a uniform, and not every truth announces itself when it arrives. The base returned to its rhythm, but it was not the same rhythm that had filled the air an hour before. It was quieter now, more deliberate, like every movement carried an extra second of thought behind it. Lieutenant Ryan Cole walked the perimeter slowly, his boots pressing into the gravel with a steady cadence, his eyes no longer scanning just for violations or misplaced steps, but for something harder to define, something that did not show up in reports or briefings. The sun hung high above, casting sharp lines across the concrete and steel, and in that light everything looked clear, precise, yet he knew now that clarity could be deceptive. Sergeant Lucas Reed worked nearby, coordinating a small team with the same calm efficiency as before, but there was a subtle shift in the way others responded to him, more attentive, more aware, as if the invisible line between rank and respect had been redrawn in ways no one could quite articulate. Cole paused near the edge of the restricted zone, the same place where it had started, and for a moment he simply stood there, not issuing commands, not correcting posture, just standing, letting the memory settle, replaying not the confrontation, but the silence that had defined it. the stillness that had held its ground without effort. And he understood something now that had not been part of his training, something no manual had prepared him for, that authority without awareness was incomplete, and that respect was not enforced, it was recognized. A young soldier approached cautiously. Stopping a few feet away, "Sir," he said, voice steady. "Do you want the perimeter reset?" Cole looked at him, really looked this time, seeing not just the uniform, but the person inside it, the small tension in his stance, the expectation of correction, and he shook his head slightly. "No," he replied, his tone calm. "Leave it as is." The soldier nodded once and stepped back. The exchange brief, but different. Something had shifted, something subtle but permanent. Cole turned his gaze outward, beyond the fence, beyond the hangars, toward the open horizon, where the vehicles had disappeared. And for a moment he imagined the road stretching miles out, the dust settling far from here, carrying Arthur Hale with it, returning him to a place where he would not be stopped, not questioned, not measured by visible standards, but understood by those who knew what to look for. Colonel Mercer's words echoed again. Not everything important is written down, and now they did not feel like instruction. They felt like truth, something that would follow him long after this assignment, long after this base. Reed stepped closer, not intruding, just present. "You will remember this one," he said quietly, and Cole gave a small nod, his eyes still forward. "Yeah," he answered, voice low. "I will." There was no need to say more, because both men knew that some moments did not fade. They settled. They anchored themselves in the way you saw the world moving forward. A distant aircraft roared across the sky, its sound rolling over the base